Is this going to be legendary whiskey? Well, there's only one way to find out in this week's review of the Legendary Dark Silkie Irish whiskey. Welcome back to the channel. I'm Matt, I'm the whiskey nerd, and like I said, this week I'm looking at the Legendary Dark Silkie whiskey. So let me get into the glass and I'll tell you a little bit more about it. Now, first off, this is coming to us from the Sliabh Liag Distillery over in Donegal. The Sliabh Liag Distillery, or the Ardara Distillery, is located on the Sliabh Liag Peninsula in Donegal. I think it was the first whiskey distillery in that area for 175 years. But this whiskey itself is not coming from that distillery. Now, they are, I think, over 3 years into their whiskey production. They recently released a special edition whiskey to mark having spirit that was 3 years old. But this here was sourced from a different distillery because they had to source whiskey in the meantime while they were kind of getting up to speed with their own whiskey production. Up to now, they have been making gins and vodka. I think the gin is called the Dulamon gin and the vodka is called the Asaranka vodka. And this one here is their sourced whiskey, the Silkie whiskey, or the Legendary Silkie whiskey. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with Irish and kind of Scottish folklore and myths, the Silkies, they're kind of like mermaids. They're not actually like mermaids, they're more like shapeshifters. They can turn from seals into women. So like a seal, a selkie, a silkie. And they would come onto land and bewitch men and then go back to the ocean and turn back into seals and become women. So they're not exactly like a mermaid who's kind of stuck in the water. These are creatures that can move between the kind of sea and the land, and they've got a silkie right there on the bottle. This kind of like quasi-mermaid, but kind of like a different type of vibe than a classic mermaid. This is one of a range of whiskies they do in this silkie range. I think they've got the standard one, the dark silkie, the midnight silkie, and then the red silkie, where they all kind of focus on different things. The standard one is kind of a classic blend. The dark silkie has more peated whiskey. The midnight silkie has even more peated. I think the red silkie has some red wine cask influence to give it a bit more fruity vibes. Although they don't share a lot of information on the bottle, on their website, they actually do go into a lot of detail about the makeup of the blend of this whiskey. So it is a blended whiskey of malt and grain whiskey. 70% of the blend is grain whiskey that was distilled in a column still and it was aged in virgin oak casks. 15% of it is double distilled single malt that was aged in sherry casks, and 15% of it is triple distilled peated single malt that was aged in bourbon casks. And that peated single malt was actually peated up to what's called 55 ppm, or parts per million, which is fairly high. Like anything over 40 or 50 parts per million in this phenols, this kind of peaty notes, is typically considered to be quite a strong kind of peaty character. Like some of those heavily peated Scotch whiskies, they start at around that 50-55 ppm. So the peated malt in here was pretty highly peated, but when you triple distill it, that comes down to about 22 parts per million. So it's still a lot of peat smoke in there, but just lessened. And because it comes in at 15% of the makeup of the blend is that 55 ppm. In the whole whiskey, you can imagine it being about 8.5 ppm is in this blend. So by Irish standards, that's a fair amount of smoke going to be in the whiskey, because typically Irish whiskey, it doesn't have a lot of smoke, not like some Scottish regions where they have a lot of smoke into their whiskey. So this is going to be a kind of a nice bit of smoke, but probably not overpowering like some of those Scotch whiskies. The whiskey comes in at 46% ABV and it's non-chill filtered. It doesn't say if it doesn't have any caramel colouring to it. I mean, it's got a pretty decent colour. It's not super dark, so I don't know if it has had any caramel colouring to it. They don't say that. They just say it's been non-chill filtered, but I do like that's coming in at 46% ABV, because 46% for me, it's a nice bit of flavour. It's not gonna be so strong you kind of burning the mouth off you, but it's also not down at 40%, so it's giving you a bit more flavour than a lot of those standard whiskies. So that's enough talking about the whiskey. I think we'll go in for the nose on the Legendary Dark Silkie. Cheers. Okay, immediately coming out of the nose, I know I said it's only like that 8.5 ppm in the actual final whiskey, but there's actually a fair amount of peat smoke coming out. It's not it's not sharp, it's not acrid, it's not like burning, but it's almost like a tobacco or leather, like kind of dark. Actually, it's quite like a coffee or a dark cocoa powder. Like none of the whiskey was aged in a stout cask, and normally I would associate those kind of flavors with whiskey that was aged in a stout cask. But here, it's like that tobacco, leathery, not overpowering, not like burnt smoke, but still quite a smoky kind of character, as if you got something that is dark, is smoky, but it's not like actively on fire, that kind of vibe. And that's all sitting on top of. There's a nice kind of almost orchard fruitsy, more pears than apples, I would say, on the nose. Still like a nice bit of caramel. I'm not really getting a huge amount of sherry influence, because I think, as I said, 15% of the blend is double distilled malt that was aged in sherry casks. Not really getting a huge amount there, but I am getting a fair bit of like a caramel butterscotch sweetness coming in underneath that nice hit of smoke. As I'm sitting there, like caramelized. I'm almost getting almost a little bit of like orange, like a burnt orange peel, like that kind of the peel though, not like the taste of the orange, like that almost sharp kind of taste of the peel that's coming through here a little bit. But again, it's all with that wrapper of that peat smoke, that peat flavor coming through. So I think that's enough on the nose. Let's go in for the palate and see how that peat balances out. Cheers. Brown sugar coming through, like really like melted brown sugar flavor coming through on the palate. You got almost like brighter fruits, like almost like raisins. Maybe that's like that sherry influence maybe coming in. But a really strong hit of smoke is coming through as well. Like you get that sweetness, you get that little bit of fruitiness, and again, it's got this wrapper of smoke. It's got this really nice. It's not sharp. It's not like some peated whiskies where I've tried where I'm just like, oh, that's all I can taste is the peat. Here I'm getting peat and other stuff, so it's quite, I think, nicely balanced. But I'm gonna go in for another sip and see what else I can find behind that peat before I talk more about it. Cheers. Second sip round, I got more of those kind of dark cocoa, espresso kind of notes, those kind of stouted notes that I was getting on the nose. Got a little bit of them. And that peat, I think actually second sip round, the peat was less pronounced. So I first sip, strong hit of peat, strong noticeable peat smoke coming through. Second sip round, I got a bit more of that orange, a bit more of that sweetness, like that peat smoke. It's there, it's present, it's quite pronounced, but it's not dominating. It's not overpowering. It's not the only note you're going to get in the whiskey. I think I quite like that, because I'm not the biggest fan of like really heavily peated whiskies. Like some I've tried, I really do like them, but I think it's where it's nicely balanced is where I like that. And here, while there's no huge sherry, there's no huge port influence to kind of fight that strong peat, because the peat isn't super strong itself, it is nicely balanced. Like you're not getting just caramel and vanilla and a bit of peat. You're getting a nice bit of caramel and vanilla, a nice bit of like those darker cocoa notes matched with a nice kind of wrapper of peat that doesn't overpower, but it complements, I think, the other flavors. But gonna go in for the finish now, see how it is and see what lasts the longest. Let's launch it. So on the finish, like again, sorry, the mouthfeel I would say is like a medium body mouthfeel, not super heavy, not super light. Like it's 70% grain, it's 30% malt, but it has this nice kind of medium body mouthfeel. But on the finish, it's quite light. Like again, I'm not going to say there's no peat, there is peat, but 70% of it is grain whiskey in that virgin oak. So you're going to get a bit of spice, bit of oak spice, and a lot of like sweetness, but then that fades off, leaving those darker notes. The fruity notes I think are pretty gone. It's just, for me, on the finish, it's those darker notes, those espresso, coffee, roasted notes, maybe like the tobacco again coming through with that peat smoke. Again, not like it's peat smoke on fire, it's that peat smoke, that wrapper, almost earthy kind of character of peaty smoke without dominating. A little bit of oak as I'm talking, tiny bit of oak spice coming up, like that kind of like almost cinnamony kind of oak spice, that oak tannin coming through, but not strong in any one direction, just a nice kind of balanced flavor. Before I give my final thoughts on this whiskey, if you're new here, scroll down, hit that thumbs up button, hit that subscribe button. I put out whiskey reviews every Wednesday, and I put out cocktail recipes featuring whiskey every Friday, and I'm going to have a cocktail recipe featuring this whiskey this Friday, so if you want to see that, make sure you hit subscribe. And also, while you're down there, let me know in the comments if you've tried the Legendary Dark Silkie, or if you've tried any other whiskies from the Sliabh Liag or the Ardara Distillery. I know they have a team of like 30 people, and James and Moira Doherty, the founders of the distillery, they're making newer whiskies, and they're kind of like generating a bit of buzz because they're using quite heavily peated whiskies, and they're making some different kind of flavors. So if you've tried anything from them, let me know what you thought. But my final thoughts on the Legendary Dark Silkie: I like it. Like, I'm not the biggest fan of heavily peated whiskies, like really super heavily peated whiskies, but I tried a little sample of this one and I was like, I quite like that. What is it? It's the Legendary Dark Silkie. I'm like, oh, I think I want to try that out and get myself a full-size bottle. And I've only had this for a little bit, but I've drunk a fair bit of it because it's quite nice. It's something that you can just go to and enjoy. It's different than normal Irish whiskies. It's got that heavy peaty character to it without being overpoweringly peaty that it would be more like a Scotch whiskey almost. It's nice. If you like peated whiskies, you'll probably like this. You might want it to be more peaty, and that's maybe where the Midnight Silkie comes in for you. If you're not the biggest fan of peat though, or you're kind of like, you can take it or leave it, this might be a really nice whiskey for you because it's got that bit of peat, but it's not overpowering. It's got that nice, you can definitely tell there's peat in it, but without being the only thing you can taste. So for me, I quite like this whiskey. I'm going to be making a cocktail with it, like I said, so if you want to see that, make sure you check back. But right now, I'm going to enjoy this, and I will see you next time. Sláinte. The whiskey comes in at 46% ABV, and it's non-chill filtered. It doesn't say if it doesn't have any caramel colouring to it. I mean, it's got a pretty decent colour. It's not super dark, so I don't know if it has had any caramel colouring to it. They don't say that. They just say it's been non-chill filtered, but I do like that it's coming in at 46% ABV because 46% for me, it's a nice bit of flavour. It's not gonna be so strong you kind of burning the mouth off you, but it's also not down at 40%. So it's giving you a bit more flavour than a lot of those standard whiskies.